Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of Public Forum. In today's edition of Public Forum, we are going to talk about the climate change negotiations. The 6th Petersburg Climate Dialogue was held in Berlin between May 17th and 19th to identify the challenges of climate change and help bring about concrete possibilities for action in the lead up to the UN Climate Change Conference of Parties to be held in Paris in December. The dialogue was aimed at strengthening the political momentum ahead of the Paris conference and also make a concrete contribution to the future negotiations. Countries like India, China, Japan, Brazil, South Africa, USA, UK, France and Italy participated in the dialogue. Does it indicate that the world community is indeed heading towards accepting and practicing real solutions to the issue of climate change? Are the differences between the developing and the developed nations fading away? We discuss the efforts to combat the ill effects of climate change in today's edition of Public Forum. And joining me in the program is Mr. Sanjay Vashisht. He is associated with the Climate Action Network, South Asia. Mr. Anand Kumar, who is a Senior Program Manager of Climate Change in Development Alternatives. And Mr. Arjuna Srinidhi, who is a Program Manager of Climate Change from the Center for Science and Environment. Welcome to the program. I would like to start the discussion with you, Mr. Sanjay Vashisht. Was the 6th Petersburg Climate Dialogue very effective in putting forth the idea that the developing nations, the developed nations together will have to approach this issue and will have to strike a balance in ensuring that they cut down their emissions to the levels required?
Petersburg Climate Dialogue at least raised profile in terms of political will. Ministers made statements, they acknowledged climate change is happening, we all are affected from it, and this dialogue is happening after last COP in Lima, and since then climate finance has been pledged for Green Climate Fund because
Yes.
that's the key to open the ambition. Some of the intended nationally determined contribution, basically emission reduction pledges have come on the table, and after that now again political leaders meet and say, hey, is it enough or do we need to do more? And this is right in the time because after 1 week or so, next UNFCCC negotiations start in Bonn from 1st of June.
Right.
And political will is high and there are some gaps. That's what our minister also raised.
Mr. Anand Kumar, you know, on this international platform, when you see the dialogues happening, does it really raise hope within countries like India, since you're the one who's working with so many people within the country, to first of all spread the knowledge about climate change and at the same time watching at the world community with you know, with a lot of hope that everyone reaches a consensus and actually fights this issue together?
Yeah, yes, because all these international negotiations which are happening and a lot of debates are happening, but there are some positive outcomes are also happening. For example, the climate finance, for example, can say, because right now the struggle is basically how do we implement the plans, action plans,
Right.
which is the main thing. And if you see in the national context, in the subnational context, where a lot of impacts are happening, there is a big gap on the finance section. So I think internationally the negotiations which are happening and the pledge which are happening, and the finances which are being allocated, I'm sure there is a positive outcome in the implementation of those action plans. And especially when we talk about the National Action Plan on Climate Change within the Indian context and the state action plans which state governments are preparing. And because one of the gap we have been dealing with the state governments and they say that this is a big gap. Because although you have all the departments and they have plans, they have budgets, but still there are gaps. So how do we fulfill that gap? How do we bridge that? So I think those outcomes at the international level certainly will feed into the national and subnational
Right.
implementation
But what we really heard from our environment minister at the forum in Berlin was that the developed nations should present their pre-2020 targets as to what kind of emission targets have they really set.
Yeah.
Do you see, Arjuna, that there is indeed some sort of a positive development there, among these nations when it comes to approaching this issue? Or do you think that we are we actually haven't moved at all?
When it comes to the pre-2020 actions, there has been very little that we have moved. And in that context, I see the increased demand by countries such as India and China during the Petersburg Climate Dialogue, as well as when India and China put out a joint climate statement a couple of weeks back on putting pressure on the developed countries to commit to more ambitious pre-2020 action. That is, I think, a very positive and a much needed action. The reason for this is, if you look at basically the science of climate change, you have a carbon budget of about 1,000 gigatons that the world is left with.
Yeah.
And we are progressing with emissions at about 50 gigatons per year, which basically means that in the next 5 years, until 2020, if there is not much of if there's not much of reduction that happens, in 5 years, 250 gigatons, that's about a quarter of the carbon budget that the world is left with. So if there is not enough action before 2020, it means that you're left with much lesser to deal with beyond 2020, and beyond 2020 is when the whole world as a whole is supposed to act on climate change, and that means there's going to be increased pressure on developing countries and the poor and vulnerable countries to also act.
Do you think, Arjuna, that we have, as it is, we have dragged this issue for this long, because it's 2015 running? By the time Paris happens, or let's say, God forbid, if it really reaches the end that we have seen how previous talks have, if there is certainly no consensus on the fact that the developing nations and the developing the developed and the developing nations should be sharing their responsibilities in an effective manner, looking at the kind of usage that they are going to do. If that happens, which means we'll be just left with about four more years in our hands, is that going to be a sufficient time? And 2020, post or pre-2020, how does the future look like for this planet?
Unfortunately, the signs right now are not very promising. That's my take on it. The climate negotiations is a lot related to not just the environment, but also related to economics. There's sort of business involved over here.
Absolutely.
And there are going to be various negotiating kind of instruments and strategies that the developed countries are using, that developing countries are going to ask for, and things like that. But I think one of the key things here to keep in mind is that the limited amount of time that we have left before we reach the threshold of 2 degrees, beyond which it is expected that there's going to be catastrophic, irreversible climate change. Just look around the country right now. India is right now facing about 0.6 degree rise compared to pre-industrial era times, and already you're seeing increasing frequency of extreme weather events. You had in the 2015, earlier this year, you had unprecedented rainfall in February, March, April, continuing in May. You had hailstorms. Kashmir experienced a second flood in a span of 6 months, which has never happened before. March was the wettest monsoon in about 50 years. It was the wettest March in about 50 years. So these clearly indicate that there is a shift in the climate. There are patterns that were not observed earlier that are happening right now, and therefore there is urgent action needed. And urgent action means acting right now, including pre-2020. And I think that should be an area where developing countries should not back down on, and it is nice and it is good that India is also insisting that there are increased commitments.
Okay, Mr. Vashisht, you wanted to say something.
About the pre-2020, I think ideally in Doha, basically it was agreed, there was a compromise between developed and developing countries, that developing countries will come on board legally binding. Legally binding in what form need to be spelled out.
Absolutely.
From 2020 onwards. However, before that, developed countries need to move for another one more period of Kyoto Protocol kind of architecture, and pre-2020 was agreed. Now, it was a promise from both sides. So on one side, while all countries are putting numbers on table for post-2020, developed countries have certainly defaulted on their promise. Now, if that's happening, what it will entail for developing countries, one, it will not give them confidence to put ambitious number for post-2020, because it's almost like transferring burden of developed countries on developing countries. Now, you cannot pay money to transfer burden. You cannot say, okay, you take 10 billion in GCF and we still transfer burden on you, and that's it. So I think developing countries, if they really want Paris to succeed, developed countries especially, if they want Paris to succeed, they need to demonstrate good numbers or higher numbers for their pre-2020 regime in June. By
But you
June
know,
they should have
the
something.
four different aspects of these climate change negotiations, the two of it, which includes mitigation and adaptation, which is actually only seen as fit for the developing nations. Do you see more movement on that? Because after all, it's the financing part where the developing countries are still fighting. They are really wanting to know as to how that mitigation is really going to happen, though at their levels they are trying to adapt as well. Do you see more positive scenario there? Though the countries, you know, I mean, about these 3-day-long summit, you watch Germany and France very proactive in stating certain things that they have done on their land and that they would like to do in future negotiations.
I'm not sure about France, but Germany has really made a promising statement, and they said they will double their contribution from 2 billion to 4 billion from 2016 to 2019, which is promising. So Germany has been very proactive, no doubt about it. But in terms of mitigation, normally it's the way I put it is, it's first of all, situation is not that great. A lot more is happening. Anand has already demonstrated that how states are working to implement their state climate action plan. That includes mitigation and adaptation. So local level, province level, state level work is happening. But then they are struggling. Global to local, the connect is missing. We talk about bigger policies, fine. But how those bigger decisions are driving action, nobody knows. For example, Green Climate Fund, 10.2 billion has been committed, out of which 4.2 has been contracted. So there's a difference between commitment by developed countries and actually contracting. So only 46% has been contracted.
Was there a time limit fixed?
There is a time limit by June. It should have been contracted. All should have been. But we heard from Green Climate Fund that by December they'll be able to contract all, and they want to start disbursement from next year. Now, mitigation, private players will come in big way, and we need to figure out how countries will drive private investments and make sure that we have alternative technologies which drive growth, development, our basic needs, plus also make sure that our carbon footprint goes down. So that's what. But public finance is required for adaptation. No corporate would like to invest into adaptation, which is more a philanthropic other than CSR, and that's it. But
which means huge sums of
money
too.
Which means huge sums. Now it's not a very profitable venture for them. And that's the statement our minister also made, that public finance is required for adaptation. Where is it? How will we raise it? And one example for India to look at it is that because adaptation is in our interest and adaptation has been prioritized by the new government. And the example is National Clean Energy Fund, which is around 17,000 crore kitty. Unfortunately, money has been diverted for Ganga cleaning. Fine, it's not a clean technology. I would say, scope need to be broadened. It can certainly drive a lot of state climate action plan adaptation work in states, which is the need of the hour.
Okay, Mr. Kumar, since we are talking about how states are working on that, give us a brief idea as to how India is approaching these two issues of adaptation and mitigation at its level.
Yeah. I think Arjuna has pointed out this. It's very evident that climate impacts are happening. You see, science is telling us, although there are some uncertainties and biasness are involved in that. So the whole changing, climate variability, adaptation is going to be critical. So we say that okay, we will slow down the climate change, sort of happening by mitigating, reducing the GHG emissions and this thing. But still, adaptation is going to be very critical. And you saw most of the state action plan, if you saw, is adaptation centric. Although they address mitigation also, but adaptation is the 80%, if you see, component of the adaptation in different sectors. And I think
which means they're just trying to adapt to the changing situations. Mitigation is when they're trying to reduce their dependence on the carbon. They are trying to reduce the carbon footprint.
Carbon footprint, yes. The whole issue is now, as Sanjay also said, is how do we implement, for example. So you have a NAPCC document, which is a national document, 2008 Prime is brought out. As per the NAPCC, every state they asked to prepare the SAPCC. Now 31 states they have already prepared the SAPCC. And some 5 states in the process, and out of 31 I think 20 states SAPCC has been approved by the steering committee also. Now the main challenge which they are facing is the SAPCC. How do we operationalize and implement it? Now where DA is already working with few states, and MP, I'll give you an example, an MP, the whole issue is how do we operationalize, for example. So for that, what my experience is, like, if you see the departments whose basically job is to implement the state action plans, the missions, the water mission, agriculture mission, and so on and so forth. Now, they already, when we interact with the departments, if you see, when we go inside, they say we are already implementing our programs. Okay, but there is a big capacity gap there. So how do they report? And here the whole INDC also is there, because INDC is being formulated, but although it will come from the state only. Okay, it will not come from somewhere. So there the big challenge is the capacity of these nodal officers. And in MP, the best thing the government has done is that there is a climate change working groups which are there.
Okay, and that's the initiative of the state government?
It's an initiative of state government.
In Madhya Pradesh?
In Madhya Pradesh.
Okay.
So those working groups' main responsibility is to actually implement the missions, climate change action plans. So there is a big capacity gap, and what they are now saying is, we are implementing our programs, schemes are there, we have a budget. Of course, there is some gap is there which can be fulfilled by climate finance, is another issue which is coming from the national and everything. Government of India is also having now fund. So they basically want, can we develop a monitoring framework, for example, and based on which we can say that this much contribution we are doing it in the NAPCC. So this is the main challenge, and we are now working on that with the departments, with the sectors, to actually help them in actually reporting back.
Okay.
So
there is a chain which is developing, as you're saying,
Yes.
and there are states who have shown the proactiveness and have really gone ahead and took some very positive steps.
Exactly.
But how do you look at the policy level? Since you said that 31 states have drafted their own state level policies to address the issue of climate change, to combat climate change. At the policy level, when you look at the print of those policies, how does it look? Very effective?
No, because see, some of the states are proactive. For example, Madhya Pradesh is very proactive, so they are ahead in implementing their program, SAPCC. But still, there is a gap in the SAPCC itself.
Okay.
And that gap is, it's not still based on the science-based, based on, when technically we say it's vulnerability assessments, for example. Based on that, you say these are the...
Give us a brief idea about what you were trying to indicate
I'm
here.
trying to say that, for example, if you see current SAPCs of most of the states, it's based on consultations.
Okay.
So you say there is a broad pointers that they say that, okay, these are the 5-6 strategies which needs to be implemented. But still, they are not clear, but these are the robust, real adaptation strategies, or there could be more based on the vulnerabilities which is currently existing with the state. So now their next step is actually they are going ahead with they're partnering with the institutions, scientific institutions, to actually conduct the vulnerability and impact assessments.
Right.
So, like for example, in MP we are also doing impact assessments for 4 sectors: agriculture, water resources, which has a maximum impact. Based on that, we will inform the departments. Okay, look, you have the SAPCC, you have this strategies, but you need to do 4-5 more. So there is a gap in the SAPCC itself.
And does the list of states include states like Orissa, Uttarakhand, Jammu and Kashmir, these places, Andhra, for example? These are the places which have been hit in the last 1 or 2 years by all kinds of calamities.
Yeah, Odisha, Odisha, because I have gone through this thing. Odisha still is in a very, it's not in that kind of shape, and now they are revising it, the Odisha thing. But Andhra, I think, is still much.
Jammu Kashmir is not there. Okay, I'll have to take a very quick break, but we'll continue with this aspect of the discussion on climate change negotiations and the efforts that are being taken domestically within India. We'll talk about that. Time for a very quick break in Public Forum. Welcome back. In Public Forum today, we are discussing the issue of combating the challenge of climate change. And the 6th Petersburg Climate Dialogue was held in Berlin between May 17th and 19th, when we saw a very proactiveness from representatives of both the developed and the developing nations, where India was also represented by the Environment Minister. And interestingly, India said that it's very important for the developed countries to come up with their pre-2020 targets as to what kind of reduction in their greenhouse gas emissions are they really going to do. And what will happen to the other aspect of the climate change negotiations, which is about how the developed countries are going to facilitate such emissions as well as the transfer of technology and finance to the developing countries, something which has been a contentious issue for all these years since we have seen the climate negotiations began at the international level. You know, we'll talk about the state action plan and some other things a little in detail, but let me just come back to the Petersburg climate dialogue. Interestingly, Arjuna, we saw Germany talking about laying the foundation for a successful COP21 in Paris. Both Germany and France were seen together doing that at Berlin, and at the same time there was a lot of emphasis on harnessing the renewable energies, ensuring that the dependence on even energies like the nuclear energy can be to an extent reduced, because after all we have seen what Japan's Fukushima accident has done. At least it has sensitized countries like Germany who have decided to phase out nuclear power from their countries. What are the signals that these countries are sending, along with of course the financing part?
Yeah, so the finance part is probably the most critical one, critical one here.
Yeah.
And as Sanjay mentioned a little earlier, yes, there was an announcement made by Germany to increase its overseas development assistance from 2 billion to 4 billion. But what we're also seeing is that on the climate finance, if you're talking about 10 billion that has been committed to the Green Climate Fund, and this is against a commitment, this is against a target of 100 billion, and 100 billion is something that the commitment is for per year, whereas 10 billion is what has been the cumulative amount of climate finance that has been mobilized until now. And even within the 10 billion you have a difference between what has actually been committed, what actually is going to come, a formal pledge being made versus just an announcement made by countries. Even if you were to take for granted that the 10 billion is going to come soon, you're talking about 10 billion distributed over 197 countries of the world, which is maybe something like 20 million per country.
Per country.
To combat the extreme disasters that
will be insufficient.
Yeah, that climate change is causing across the world. Just to give you an example, if you want to compare it with the kind of finance that India needs to be able to deal with climate change.
Right.
There are estimates that basically India is spending between 1 to 2% of its GDP on dealing with climate change. This is both in terms of dealing with the extreme weather events, the losses and damages that are happening because of it, as well as adapting to longer term consequences of climate change, longer term slow onset kind of disasters, droughts, etc. So 1% of its GDP is something like 100,000 crores. $20 billion, so just by one country, and you're talking about a green climate fund which is in totality is less than what one country needs.
And when you say that India is spending this much, is it some sort of an annual figure that we are looking at?
Yes, this is per year. So I mean, while there is no official climate budget for dealing with climate change, but you have various government programs that in some way or the other are dealing
directly,
with,
indirectly.
Yeah, you have a disaster management fund. You have government programs such as the NREGA, which also deal with building resilience through soil and water conservation measures, etc. So you can estimate through some of these schemes on how much India is spending. So basically, you're seeing a big gap between what the world needs and what has been committed to, and that is coming out.
You know, there is an interesting development which happened when the Prime Minister was in China, that the two countries came together and they look like some sort of a consensus between China and India on addressing the issue of climate change. Though we have seen that China in the past has taken an independent view of the situation, keeping in mind that they of course form a group of the basic nations, which is represented by two other countries. What does it really say about the power of the developing nations? Do you see that basic or this group of, or just the China and India duo, are they really going to have a major say in the upcoming round of negotiations too?
Yes, they will have a big say in the upcoming round of negotiations, but I think it's very important to understand that there is a difference between where India stands in its development pathway and where China stands.
Right.
Being two large economies, they all tend to get clubbed together, but we should always recognize that there are differences between the two countries. in terms of the progress in terms of its development. If you were to look at just the per capita emissions as an indicator of how much energy consumption and how much development has happened in the two countries, India's per capita emissions is about 1.8, 1.9 tons per person. Whereas China's it's equivalent to the per capita emissions of the European Union, about 6 or 7 tons per annum per person. So this gives you an indication that our emissions is still 1/4, a quarter of the kind of emissions per person that is emitted in China. So there is a big difference between where India stands and where China stands. But
so the voicing of concerns, what I'm trying to gauge here, Mr. Vashisht, is the fact that how powerful is this group of developing nations when they are going to put, and when they have in fact taken this whole drive of getting the finance and getting the support and technology from the developed countries. On top of that, the understanding of what a developing nation needs, building that with the other set of countries. How effective would that be when they have differences within?
Well, I think first, if we want a deal in Paris, India, China need to be on board, including Brazil, South Africa.
And you see them on board.
They will be on board.
They have to be,
so
right.
One thing I remember, one senior former negotiator told me that good news is there's going to be a deal. No matter whether it's 2-degree compliant.
I heard it 2 years ago.
You heard it. Right.
I heard it 2 years ago too.
You heard it in earlier program also.
Yeah, you're right. When
so
we had a former climate change negotiator.
So that's the good news. But then whether it's 2-degree compliant or 4-degree compliant is something we are working on. The struggle is more about that. The message that developed countries are giving to developing countries, and basically they are aiming for India, China, Brazil, South Africa, are basically like-minded group. It's no more basic. Like basic group has become bigger. They call it LMG, like-minded group.
Right.
And the message is we are putting money as you wanted. It's not enough. We are putting money. We are putting numbers. And then they also say that since we have complied on 2 promises of post-2020 numbers and climate finance, well, we can afford to default over pre-2020, which is not a very good sign. So the message that the negative message is, please now you put in your number. Okay. The positive message that we are getting from developed country, which you also asked Arjuna earlier, is that from Germany especially, is false solution like nuclear will not work. After a few years or maybe few decades, you may have to change the technology in case, God forbid, there is a disaster. So renewable energy has a future. They have showed it in German energy transition system also, that renewable energy, solar, wind works very fine. The cost can be managed if the quantity goes up, and that's what our consumer needs. We choose an electricity based on how much it will cost us, not based on how much emission we put on in the atmosphere. That's very simple.
But is it really going to be that cost effective?
Well, India has already put 175 gigawatt of vision for renewable energy, which is solar, wind, biomass and small hydro also.
Right, and we have a huge target of achieving solar energy too by the end of
100 gigawatt of solar and 60 gigawatt of wind, 10 gigawatt of mini hydro and 5 gigawatt of biomass.
Okay, let me ask Mr. Anand Kumar here. Do you see a lot of sensitization on that part too? I mean, I have often encountered such enthusiasm about solar energy and others, even in the suburbs of Gurgaon and other places, by minimum, let's say, a daily wage worker. Do you really have you really sensed it in states like Madhya Pradesh where you have actively worked?
Yeah, I think government is now very keen to, they are adopting this RE-based renewable energy.
Among the people, have you seen that?
And common people, communities, still they see the whole issue. The issue is the lack of awareness. For example, they because they know that climate change impacts are happening, and this thing strategies needs to be adapted on the ground. But still, there is when you come to renewable energy kind of thing, solar, wind, and this thing, there is a lack of awareness at that level.
And do we have really do we have that market, to bring in those things for anybody to switch to solar energy if one plans to? Let's say if I try to do it tomorrow, I don't want to have this connection, the conventional forms. I just want to switch to solar energy. Do we have the resources available in the market? At least we have the sun.
Yeah, resources are there, but the whole idea is like when you ask farmers or local people there, I mean they have different issues. For example, so are they geared up to do shift this and implement solar or those kind of projects? But yeah, still if it is streamlined from the state, there is a policy or something like which goes at the district level and the block level, then I think they are going to adopt those things. But still there is a big gap, I think.
And any change in the perceptible change in agricultural practices, because that is again one of the crucial areas.
Yes, yes, sure. Because on the there are two things happening. For example, in a state like Madhya Pradesh, and I'm sure in other states also, we work in Bundelkhand area, which is a very highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Farmers they know that some impacts are happening on the ground, and they are already shifting their practices, for example, agriculture practices. But again, I go back and whether these practices are sustainable. So for one season they will shift to some alternative crops, for example. But again, what happens to when there is a big climate variability is there. So I think the whole issue is again technology, for example, whether these technologies are appropriate. So we need to blend formal science, informal science, and for the farmers. So yes, they are shifting their practices, but still, I say it's not robust. So we need to do an assessment, for example. So we, as a DA, as an interface organization, our job is to actually bridge that gap. So whatever technologies are there, which the research is happening, how those technologies can be taken to the ground.
That's right.
For example, Agriculture Research Institute, IRI, they develop a lot of technologies, but those technologies, in the lab and this thing. So how do we take those technologies on the ground? So that is something which needs to be done. So there.
Okay, but when it comes to technology and accepting the best practices and then, trying to replicate that in our states, because we have a variety of soil, land, people, all kinds of things in this country. There are issues of IPRs, which we heard the Environment Minister also speak about. Are the countries really keen on addressing that part too?
No, not yet. That's a major challenge now, and I think our minister also raised it very legitimately. He said IPR issues need to be relaxed, IPR regime need to be relaxed, especially for the climate-friendly technologies. And that's a very strong message that while if you want us to be ambitious, we want very predictable technology available to us. You cannot make profit out of a misery. If we are suffering, world is suffering, or people are suffering, then we should get those technologies, irrespective of your profit margins and all that. That's one message very clearly. Second issue is on adaptation also. Adaptation is so diverse, the solutions will be so diverse that we have to identify practices at the local level. It cannot be, like mitigation, okay, solar, so 100 gigawatt. You cannot do that. And that is why, especially on the agriculture sector, diversified agriculture practices or cropping patterns need to be promoted.
Right.
And that's one work that many organizations on ground are working. State is working. And I think state has more legitimacy to drive it. Second, if there are new technology or new practices being introduced to a farmer, now farmer doesn't know where to sell it. If they have been growing wheat, and suddenly they say, okay, you also need to grow mangoes, or let's say some other fruits. Okay, where to sell it? So market linkages need to be established, and that's another challenge at the grassroots level, because livelihood security depends on that also.
Right.
Second is credit lines needs to be extended. They know where to access money for their conventional cropping, but where to get some credit to practice new farming,
right.
they need to do that. Plus, more and more area need to be bought under irrigation, especially when we are talking about 40% of our area is still without is on rainfed,
right.
maybe more,
Yeah.
and that's impacted directly. We saw what happened in March when rainfall happened and farmer suicides, because agriculture was completely, especially standing wheat crop was finished in the ground.
So, and the unseasonal rains is also, it's
so now the climate impacts are touching life.
Right.
It's no more a political issue or to be discussed at UNFCCC. It is to be discussed at the grassroots level. That's it.
Arjuna.
Yeah, I mean, talking about the kind of impacts that the poor, vulnerable communities, the agriculture community, as Sanjay was talking about, is facing in India. I mean, irrespective of what is happening at the international climate negotiations and what comes out of Paris, there's a lot that we can be doing internally within the nation, and we have the capacity to do it. For instance, in the recent months of February and March, when the unseasonal rains hit the farmers so significantly, one of the things that came out very starkly, the picture was that the relief and compensation mechanisms were not strong enough to compensate the farmers for their losses. We've been doing a study right now at the Center for Science and Environment, and we have been looking at some of the data coming out of what were the reasons behind the kinds of damages and the cases of farmer suicides that you were seeing in the states of Uttar Pradesh, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh coming out. What comes out is that, for example, access to insurance. Access to insurance across the country is only about 20% of the farmers have insurance. The government programs on relief during a calamity that happens, and the government themselves admit to this, is that it is relief and it's not compensation. So it's basically relief to help the farmers tide over the current kind of crisis. The relief covers maybe 25% to 30% of the damages that have occurred. It gives the farmer some amount of money to move on to the next agriculture cycle and cover his input costs. But it is not really a compensation of the total loss that the farmer has suffered. So the only form of compensation that the farmers have access to is actually insurance. And if that is the case, then we should be looking at improving the penetration of insurance, particularly if we are looking at an increased frequency of weather events.
Right.
But insurance needs to be regulated because poor farmer, it's like same. You make profit out of the misery. For insurance company also, it's an opportunity. They're extending their purview. And I think that needs to be regulated.
I think everything is, interlinked here.
Yeah.
And when you address the issue of climate change, there are several other things which have to be checked. We've just talked about one aspect, which is agriculture. The other aspect, of course, is industrialization and some other things. And for India, of course, it seems to be, for any developing country for that matter, whichever country wants to develop, will have to really strike a balance on those counts. We'll take a very quick break now in Public Forum. Please stay tuned for more on the other side of this break. Welcome back. In Public Forum today, we are discussing the issue of combating climate change. Okay, and one would certainly have to look at the issues and the platform that has been set for the Paris Agreement. Before that, in June, we are going to have another round of negotiations. But in December this year, we might see some sort of a clear deal. As Sanjay also said, that we are certainly going to have a deal, but what kind of deal is something one can be just a bit skeptical about. But, if I start with you here, Arjuna, looking at the past of the climate change negotiations and looking at it from today's perspective, how difficult or easy it is for a country like India, for that matter, to address the issue of climate change without disturbing its cycle of development. Since we need that development, we have a huge percentage of people who live below poverty line. We have to alleviate them, we have to eliminate poverty, we have to address the issue of jobs and hunger and a lot of other issues. How capable do you think India is, and how would you rate our position vis-a-vis the 2020 crisis, which all the countries should be preparing themselves for?
Yeah, if you're talking about the 2020 crisis, I mean, basically you're referring to the levels of emissions that the world would have accumulated while getting to 2020.
Yeah.
And if that is the case, then India doesn't have much to worry about, because it has not historically been responsible for majority of this change. For example, if you look at historical emissions, the US has been responsible for about 20% of the emissions. European Union is again close to that. China has been responsible for another 10%. So just these three groups, the EU, China and US together, have been responsible for about 50% of the total emissions, whereas India's historical emissions is about less than 3%. So if you're talking about historical responsibility for creating the current climate. India is not anywhere close to the kind of numbers that China, the US and EU have emitted. But of course, India is one of the most vulnerable regions which is affected by extreme weather events and which will be impacted by climate change. So it is in our interest to grow in a way that is not going to harm our future generations.
And since you said that our per capita emission is also quite less as compared to a country like China, whose economy is almost going in the same pace as India's is, do we have much faster, right? But you know, looking at the fact that we have taken a lot of steps at the domestic level to switch to renewable energy, to harness renewable energy, to ensure that, you know, these emissions can be reduced. Do you see that really helping us? Because, you know, we need the level of industrialization that we need. It's going to, in fact, increase with more clarity on legislations, from mining to land acquisition to more. Are we really going to, are we equipped to handle that?
Yes, so I mean, definitely, as India moves towards meeting a lot of its basic development needs, providing access to energy, providing access to water, building its infrastructure, it is inevitable that our emissions are going to grow. Our per capita emissions will also rise. We were talking about us being close to 1.9 tons per capita emissions. By 2025, 2030, it might be close to 4 tons. But it is still going to be only a fraction of what the EU's is and what China's will be. So our emissions is going to grow, but it will always be much lesser than the developed countries.
And the developed countries, as we are talking about the US, has not really brought down or has not really set a very legitimate targets for its emissions as the developing countries.
They're talking about an emissions target of between 26 to 28% by 2025. But the key thing here, and this is where there's a game in the numbers, is that if you're looking at European Union, which is probably one of the more progressive blocs in dealing with climate change, their targets of 40% is with regard to 1990 levels. Whereas the US targets of 26 to 28% is with regard to 2005 levels. So effectively, if you are going back to 1990, the benchmark for most of the countries to rate its climate action, the US action is barely comes to 12%, 14% over 1990, 1990 less than 10% of 1990 levels. And this is much less compared to even what the US committed to in Copenhagen when it made its first kind of voluntary pledge of being on path to reduce emissions to close to 30% by 2025.
Actually, 9% should have been the target for Kyoto Protocol, at least 9%.
So they're backtracking. They're not even staying, they're not even, it's not even on par with what they had previously committed to.
So you don't see the US and India on the same page when it comes to things like this, right?
India is doing much more. Shali, let me tell you that. You just asked a question about whether it's in the interest of India to, whether it is possible for India to address climate change while it has a development agenda. Let me also tell you, look at the Uttarakhand, Jammu Kashmir floods, Kosi floods in Bihar, or recently farmers impacted in North India because of untimely unseasonal rains. Number of people going below poverty line have increased. So even if on one side we try to raise out of 300 million people some percentage out of poverty trap, large number goes down because of climate impacts.
But you see, there is a parallel story of growth. Mr. Anand Kumar, you also see people, their wages in fact have improved. Their purchasing capacity has improved, and which is why you see in the urban centers like the city of Delhi, people possessing a lot of assets, which includes cars and other vehicles, and you see more pollution, you see poison, in fact poisoning of air that happens in places like this. What does it really indicate about our habits? Because you see, if one has to address the issue of climate change, it can't be just by countries and their leaders at the international level. Much has to be done by the people who habited those countries.
It was, I think the question which you asked about the development and climate change, because development has to go on. And if you see in the Indian context, I mean, development agenda is there. But with that development, how do we make sure that climate change, risks we are mitigating? And I think if you see how some of the states, for example, I quote because we have been working with some of the states, they have already started, for example, in order to move from high carbon to low carbon, low emission, what kind of technologies, for example? For example, currently, if you see in the urban sector, if you talk about services, electricity, transport, they are already doing a lot of using some kind of technologies. Like for example, road making, they are using some technologies, materials, building materials. In order to switch from high carbon to low carbon, what kind of more technology? For example, fly ash. So from red brick to fly ash bricks. So those kind of technologies they have already started, and now if you see Madhya Pradesh, they are already doing their SOR, schedule of rates, for example. So what they are looking at is based on the assessments. So can we propose some new technologies which can be integrated into the schedule of rates? So those kind of things are already happening. So the technologies, those POPs, package of practices, which can be taken up and integrated into. The second thing which I would like to also is the climate proofing planning processes. Because if you see the real impacts which are happening at the local level, the communities, the farmers, the poor people, the population below poverty line, how do we integrate the climate change issues into the local planning processes? And a lot of money, so for example, for one district, if you see 1,000 crores is the budget, and they have different kind of plans are there. But we need to see from the climate perspective what kind of climate proof plans we can integrate into the planning process, and that's implementation happens. Because implementation has to happen at the local level. So one of the clear focus of the government also is to look at how do we mainstream or integrate climate change concerns into the local planning processes. The Panchayat PRIs, Panchayati Raj institutions. PRI is one means of doing it. So that is some
strong institutions.
Yes, strong institutions. They control, the planning committees are there. But again, as I said earlier also, the lack of capacities are there. So we as an institution has to build the capacities of those people. So that they can
become a part of this cycle.
Yeah,
Arjuna, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Anant that there's a lot that needs to happen in terms of capacity building, because otherwise you have plans and you have frameworks on dealing with climate change, you have the national action plan, you have the state action plans, but if they have to benefit the people who really need these action plans to work for them, you need a lot of gap filling that needs to happen. For instance, if you're looking at the state action plan of Jammu and Kashmir, and this was an example that came up earlier, the Jammu and Kashmir floods that happened last year, as well as now in February, in a span of 6 months, showed that though the state action plan explicitly mentions cloudbursts and explicitly mentions heavy rainfall, landslides as calamities that are potentially very frequently possible in Jammu and Kashmir, the whole machinery to deal with this disaster took a lot of time last year when the floods happened in Srinagar to come together and to save the number of lives that could have otherwise could not have happened. And you have gaps because, for example, the weather forecast is made by the Indian Met Department, but they make only weather predictions. But if a flood is going to happen, the flood warning is supposed to be issued by the Central Water Commission. But after the flood warning has happened, if there is a disaster in which lives are being lost, property is being lost, the disaster response force is the National Disaster Response Force, the NDRF. So you're talking of 3 different kind of bodies. And the whole action...
And the Water Commission doesn't have the resources. They have themselves said that they don't have the capacity to address those things.
So
and that's where the ISRO comes into the picture. It has in fact volunteered. Why can't we use the satellites to have those right predictions in place? But, above all, coming back to the question of climate change talks, Sanjay Vashisht, do you see that, how do you see the June round and later the Paris deal? I mean, if you have to just sum it up.
June is going to be pre-2020, full call for pre-2020. India is holding its INDCs, Intended National Determined Contribution. Work is happening, consultations are happening in all ministries. That's a good thing that new government has followed. New government is also talking to NGOs. So it's going to be pre-2020 while work is going on post-2020 numbers for India, which is going to be somewhere in September or October. We are hoping to get something. Plus climate finance. And climate finance, because we are talking about 2020 to 2030 period, it has to be long term. Because so far Green Climate Fund is only till 2020 and 100 billion every year after that.
This is right.
It has to be scaled up. A new phenomena of loss and damage has come. That need to be accounted. Money need to be paid for that also. And after that, between June and Paris, there's going to be 2 more intersessional. 1 or 2 weeks.
So you see that the roadmap towards approaching that $100 billion fund, and as you said, that the damages should also be a part of it.
Roadmap for how to scale up 100 billion. What about Green Climate Fund after 2020, what kind of amount need to come in, pre-2020 ambition, and also we have started talking about how to legally package it. That's going to be the focus from June onwards till Paris. In Paris, everybody will go
and
to
this
sign.
year is certainly crucial. Countries really cannot afford to ignore
No.
and miss this December
No,
opportunity.
because otherwise for developing countries, it's like taking burden from developed countries and taking it on themselves by getting some money, climate finance. That's not justifiable. No political leader can go back to its country and say, we signed the agreement, however, developed countries did not put any number on pre-2020. I mean, it's like taking burden. It's not like contributing efforts. It's like taking burden.
Arjuna, do you see that the countries would certainly take it as a very serious opportunity, keeping in mind we all know the track record of all of these nations?
Yeah, the next couple of rounds before Paris is going to be exciting because some of the big countries
and also going to be an indicator of how they're going to really behave in Paris, right? Yeah.
Some of the big countries have begun putting their numbers out on what is going to be their post-2020 action. And now is when a lot of civil society bodies, a lot of the, countries themselves are going to start adding up these numbers and see whether, is this going to take us to above the 2-degree regime, or is it sufficient to be able to, for the world to stay under 2 degrees or not. Indications right now, looking at the numbers that US, EU have put out, and China's statement last year in November that it's going to peak in 2030, clearly show that it's not going to be enough for the world to stay under 2 degrees. So questions are going to be asked about the ambitiousness and the adequacy of the actions being taken by a number of these countries. That will get debated, that will maybe stall negotiations. So it's going to be a few interesting rounds of negotiations before the final deal can be hammered out in Paris.
Okay, so we have more time to see as to how countries are really going to chalk out their plan for the future of themselves and for other fellow nations.
I
Anandji,
just want to say
final comments.
Yeah, sorry. The INDC is being formulated. Consultations are happening, and I'm sure, Paris deal will happen, and some kind of in terms of finance will formed up, for example. But still, as Arjuna initially said, that it will be. I don't think it is going to meet the requirements. So still in that situation, the country's budget, existing resources, and how do we optimize that? I think it's still going to be very critical.
Right.
So that's why the integration and mainstreaming will happen, and still the climate finance will fill that gap. Is going to do that.
Fine. So I think that gives us enough room to think and wonder as to how we at our level can address this issue.
Yes.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for talking to us and for joining us here in the studio of Loksabha TV. That's all we have for you in this edition of Public Forum. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.